Welcome, everybody. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan voter education organization encouraging informed, active participation in government. We believe that voting is a fundamental citizen right that must be guaranteed. While the League does not support candidates or parties, we do take positions on issues we have studied. Our programs do not necessarily represent these positions, but do provide forums to increase understanding of public policy issues. One quick important policy announcement is that the League of Women Voters of Washtenaw County reminds you that we and the League of Women Voters of Michigan oppose the Secure MI Vote petition drive. We strongly encourage you not to sign the Secure MI Vote petition drive. You can see the website. If you go to lwvanarbor.org, it'll switch to our new URL, which is a little more complicated, but it's Washtenaw County as a whole. All right. That's where you find the information and the action. Thank you very much. And now we're ready to begin. I'm happy to introduce my friend and your host today, Shelley Shanfield.
Hi, thank you, Teresa. Welcome to Lunch and Learn. And the theme for our Brews and Views and Lunch and Learn programs in 2022 is Women-Powered Democracy. And in the first 2 months of this year, we are focusing on how women can take action on public health issues. Many see domestic violence falling more under law enforcement. We will explore that in today's program, as well as the February 9th Brews and Views on gun ownership and women's safety. However, domestic violence has huge impacts on survivors' health and thus public health. So we will also discuss that in these 2 programs. How common is domestic violence? According to the National Center Against Domestic Violence, in 2019 in Michigan, 36% of women and about a quarter of men experience some form of intimate partner violence. The resulting stresses affect public health in the community, first through homelessness, with a survey from the National Network to End Domestic Violence reporting that over 63% of homeless subjects reported intimate partner violence. Another stress comes from the danger of an abuser taking control of family finances and absconding with resources that should belong to both. Further, when survivors must change their identities and relocate in order to hide from their abusers, they lose work histories and references, which hinder them from finding new employment, which is a huge stress. These significant stressors exacerbate the numerous short and long-term physical health issues resulting from domestic violence, further undermining survivor well-being and increasing serious public health problems. Immediate injuries may include hearing loss, disfigurement, joint damage, concussions, miscarriages, broken bones, wounds, and sexually transmitted infections that must be treated. And that's not all. And then long-term chronic health issues. One long-term study of women survivors found musculoskeletal problems, heart, skin, and gastrointestinal disorders, fibromyalgia, as well as neurological disorders, substance abuse, and mental health issues. And this is just a partial list. We cannot turn away from the huge costs that domestic violence cause in survivors' personal and economic well-being, as well as in public health. What can we as voters and citizens do to take action against it? What are the policy issues that we can support in this fight? Our speaker today can help us understand what we can do. Nicole Beverly holds a master's degree in clinical social work and is the author of the compelling memoir, Finding Nicole, a true story of love, loss, betrayal, fear, and hope. I've read it and I highly recommend it. Surviving domestic violence and stalking and having lived under threats of murder from her ex-husband, she became and continues to be a passionate advocate for other survivors of intimate partner violence. The process of leaving her abusive ex-husband, a former police officer, brought her up short against the legal system. Though meant to protect her, legal institutions often left her and her 2 sons in extreme physical danger. Her experiences led her to found the Enough Initiative Domestic Violence Prevention Organization, which provides resources to help others experiencing similar threats. Nicole is currently its president. Nicole and her story of survival have been featured on CNN's Inside Evil show in the Until Death Do Us Part segment. on the Huffington Post and NPR, and in the Detroit Free Press and many other news outlets. Nicole, welcome.
Thank you so much. And it was an amazing introduction. I will be, during my talk today, touching a little bit more in depth on a lot of what Shelley mentioned in the introduction in terms of issues that are impacting victims in our county, state, and truly the whole entire country. And I just want to let everyone know, I do have my sometimes obnoxious dog behind me. Hopefully she won't be disruptive. During the Zoom, she'll be comfortable, but I just wanted to give everyone a warning. You hear strange noises. So we already got a pretty good introduction of myself from Shelley. I met my abuser in college, which we're finding through data and research that most victims have their first experience with domestic violence between the ages of 16 and 24. So I was 18, I was right, in the middle of that age group, and no one had ever taught me the red flags to look out for. So I didn't know when I met him what to look out for in this dating relationship. On the surface, he seemed amazing. He seemed like the perfect person, funny, charismatic, captain of the football team at Eastern Michigan University, where we met. So through my personal experiences and the fact that I was able to get out of that relationship alive, I've become passionate in terms of my advocacy work and paying it forward to help other victims escape safely as possible and successfully. I do have two sons, Miles and Carter, who are now 22 and 18. Seems so weird to even say that out loud, how old they are. But I want it towards the end, I want you guys to please feel free to put questions in chat. I always say no question is a bad question or an inappropriate question. Speaking at high schools, I've probably been asked every question there is and some tough questions. So I'm prepared to answer. Not everyone has had an opportunity to speak to a survivor of domestic violence and stalking and ask questions. So I really want to make sure that people feel comfortable that they can do that and that I'm willing to answer those. You can switch to the next slide. So this just talks about, go back one. A little bit more about the Enough Initiative, which is my nonprofit organization. Before actually starting and getting our 501c3, I was doing the work of speaking at high schools and to sororities and colleges and groups of people. And I was going through the court process of not knowing if my ex-husband was going to be released from prison. As Shelley mentioned, after he was finally convicted of domestic violence and aggravated stalking and was in prison, he did begin to attempt to hire other individuals to kill me from prison on multiple occasions. And as she also mentioned in my book, law enforcement let me down many times. The system let me down many times. And I did not know if I was going to be able to stay in the state of Michigan and be safe, or if my kids could be safe. So once I was able to get the attention with the help of the Detroit Free Press and Inside Evil with Chris Como and people across the state and nation, enough attention brought to our case, and the Attorney General's office picked up our case and won successfully in court after other prosecutors in Luce County had refused to move forward with the last attempt to hire. I knew we had at least 10 more years to be here. Currently, my ex-husband's earliest release date is 2030. And I decided that that was enough time for me to officially start a nonprofit organization, and that our focus would be on prevention, getting into high schools, teaching the red flags, because what we know from national statistics, state statistics, county statistics, this problem is not going away. This problem is not getting smaller. In fact, the opposite is happening. Domestic violence homicides are increasing every single year. So until we begin prevention, like we do with any other epidemic, we're not going to create change. We're going to continue to put out fires. I see our little sign down at the bottom with in the plant holder. Many of you may have seen the purple signs throughout downtown Ypsilanti in October. That was our organization, and spreading awareness just to get the word out, get conversations going, talking about it. So in addition to doing high school presentations, which we've done all over the state in colleges, we've done North Carolina A&T University, the Kappas invited us to present there, which was an amazing opportunity. We also do victim survivor empowerment retreats and workshops. And I still look at that as prevention, because statistics show us that when people leave abusive relationships, unless they've done the work to rebuild themselves and feel solid and whole on their own, they're very likely to enter another abusive relationship. So a big piece of the work that we do is also with victims and just empowering them, teaching them new coping strategies, getting out of old behavior patterns and relationship patterns so they don't continue to end up in abusive relationships that are maybe not physically abusive, but emotionally abusive or financially abusive. These are things that we commonly see. We listed a few of our upcoming events. We will be doing a murder mystery gala fundraiser at the Ypsilanti Freight House on April 23rd. And I know Shelley is going to share that ticket link. We have so far, I know we have some special guests playing roles in our murder mystery. Ellie Savitt will be participating, and Ariane Slay will also be participating. We'll have a few other special guest performers that'll be joining us that evening, but all of the proceeds from that fundraiser will be going directly to our resilience retreat, which you can see a picture of down at the bottom. We focus heavily on teaching survivors coping strategies that they can use to rebuild themselves and recover from the traumatic experience of sexual assault and domestic violence. I also will be doing, this is probably the first of many, February is Dating Violence Awareness Month. So I usually get into as many high schools as possible. Zoom's making it easier. I'll be presenting at Pinconning High School, February 10th. And that came out of a presentation I did last year for Wyandotte High School. And one of the students there has since moved to Pinconning and invited me to have the opportunity to present there. So I'm super excited about that. And then in August, we will be having our resilience retreat, and we'll get that information out there. Our goal is to have enough fundraising done that the event is free for everyone. And we were able to accomplish that last year. So that took barriers away from people who otherwise couldn't afford to participate in the event. We did it at the Stone Chalet in Ann Arbor, and we had amazing speakers and presenters, and it was completely free. And our goal is to maybe do 2 of those this year because the results and everything, all the feedback that we got was phenomenal. Okay. So I'm just going to go through some facts. Shelley touched on a few, but I'm going to add a few more. So as we know, domestic violence isn't just hitting, it's not just kicking or pushing. It can be physical abuse, it can be mental, verbal, financial, sexual, or what we're seeing a lot, and I will be talking about further, is litigation abuse in the courts through family court system. In most states, including ours, domestic violence is still a misdemeanor charge up until the 3rd offense. And even once someone may have actually been convicted 6 or 7 times, that offense is often pled back down to a 2nd offense, so it remains a misdemeanor crime. And the sentencing guidelines for misdemeanors apply rather than a felony charge, which animal abuse is a felony charge on the 1st offense. So I think that is a huge problem that, you know, love my beautiful dog sitting behind me, but and value her and animals, but I think we need to value victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault just as much, and hold the perpetrators just as accountable as we do the perpetrators of animal cruelty. As mentioned, domestic violence is one of the leading causes of homelessness for women and children. The studies I've recently seen have suggested 70 to 80% of homeless women and children have stated that they have been impacted by domestic violence that has led to their homelessness. 1 in 3 women will become victims of domestic violence. And sadly, the statistics in the high schools right now are 1 in 3 high school students are already victims of domestic violence. 15.5 million children will witness domestic violence this year alone. And what statistics tell us and research and studies is that children who witness domestic violence are much, much more likely to end up in an abusive relationship in the future, either as the victim or the perpetrator, because they've grown up in a setting where this domestic abuse, verbal abuse, financial abuse is the norm. It's what they're used to. They don't know different. They don't, know that those things are red flags and things you don't want in a relationship. So all those children are much more likely to be victims or perpetrators in the future. And that's one of the things we really focus on in our presentations in high schools, is that it's not just about educating victims, it's also about educating high school students who may recognize some of the red flags in themselves as being a perpetrator, and what they can also do to stop the cycle. 1 in 6 men will become victims of domestic violence. If any of you have an opportunity on our Enough Initiative website, which will also be shared, last October, we did several Facebook Live videos and interviews with different populations, and one was men who were victims of domestic violence, and they shared very openly and honestly and candidly how they became a male victim of domestic violence. So if you have an opportunity, that was a great talk that we had. And there are several others on our website. National trends tell us that 2,300 women will likely be murdered in the United States by their partners this year. So over the course of since 2017, we've seen an increase every single year of domestic violence related homicides. So we're obviously moving in the wrong direction. And it's been a significant increase every year. I think between 17 and 2021, it's been a 30% increase, which is huge. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury in women. So it accounts for more injuries in women than car accidents, robberies, muggings, and rapes combined. So that is a fact that states, is pretty clear that women or victims may not always share at the hospital or at the doctor's office that the true cause of their injury, because we become masters at hiding what's really happening behind closed doors. But in more recent studies, it is showing to be the #1 cause of injury to women. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. I just wanted to share this with you. This is just some statistics from our presentations in high schools of teaching students red flags of domestic violence and the reasons women victims stay in domestic violence relationships, what to do if they see domestic violence happening in their school or community. So the graph numbers on the left show pre-presentation numbers of what the knowledge base that those students had. And then the numbers to the right show the increase. So 92% of students after attending our presentation were able to identify at least 3 reasons why victims end up staying in abusive relationships, which we're going to get to, and I'll explain why that's so important. 92% were able to name 4 or more red flags for dating, so that if they're dating someone, they know what to watch out for. And 92% were then able to identify what to do if they see it happening in their school or community after our presentations. So this is it's kind of a startling statistic, but it's a very real statistic. And it's that victims of domestic violence will wait up to 35 times before calling the police. There are multiple reasons behind that, and we're going to get to that. A lot of those fall into the same reasons that victims stay with their abusers. At first, it's love and the apologies and the abuse cycle. They believe it's not going to happen again. And then it might be threats if you call the police. And then it might be you have heard stories of other victims who have called police and have gotten no help, or victims who have called the police and their abusers were let back out the very next day and things were worse for that person. So there are a lot of reasons contributing to this. Also, shame and guilt, which many victims of domestic violence have because of society and the messages that society tells us about victims of domestic violence. And that's another thing our organization tackles, is making sure that we can reduce the stigma associated with having been a victim and now being a survivor of domestic violence, and owning your story and the fact that you're now a survivor and what happened to you is not your fault. Another fact, Black women experience intimate partner violence at rates 35% higher than white women. That national statistics are showing that. And our organization in particular, we're not just about diversity, we're about anti-racism. And we are committed to making sure that we are involving everyone in our community and touching on the needs of everyone in our community, because we know that these statistics exist and it's happening. And we need to get in and touch the lives of everybody, not just certain people. Men, another statistic, men can be and are victims of domestic violence. They're much less likely to report it because of the same stigma of being weak, people making jokes about it, laughing about it. I know male victims that I've spoken to about it said that people didn't believe them. They're more likely actually to get arrested when they do call for help by the police. So there are a lot of obstacles that male victims face. And we also, as an organization, really do our best to make sure that we include their voice in the work that we do. Just a little bit of basic information about the abuse cycle. Some of you may be very familiar with this, some may not, but it just really helps understand how someone can get caught up in an abusive relationship to begin with. If I had been one of the high school students sitting in my presentation at 16 years old, I would have said, I will never be in an abusive relationship. I'm too strong for that. I'm not that stupid. I would leave, the second somebody was abusive towards me. But once you really have a good understanding of how the abuser manipulates the victim into this abuse cycle, it becomes much more clear. Truly, I woke up one day and recognized how I am in an abusive relationship. How did this happen to me? Having been this strong 16-year-old, thinking in my mind that it never could happen to me. So early on in the relationship, it's calm. This person presents themselves as the perfect person. They're wearing a mask. They're getting to know everything about you, what you like, what makes you happy. They're often rushing you into a relationship, into an exclusive relationship, wanting to spend all their time with you. It feels good. It makes you happy. Things are positive. And you fall in love with this person. And you may have also heard this as the honeymoon phase. And that's kind of what it becomes as the cycle is perpetuated. And then over time, people can only keep that mask on for so long before it starts to slip and their true personality starts to come out. So there may be some, for me, it started out with name calling. It started out with put downs that were then disguised as, oh, I was just kidding. but the seed had been planted about the negative thing my ex-husband or boyfriend at the time had said. So I worried about it, even though he said he was just joking. Things became my fault. If something went wrong, it was my fault. So I started walking on eggshells and was always worried about pleasing him and it not upsetting him. And then the next phase would be the crisis phase. So that's where you have the blow up. You might have threats, you may have the physical violence, the extreme emotional abuse, financial abuse, destruction, fear for your children's safety. And then that's followed with the honeymoon phase. I'm so sorry. It's never going to happen again. I was just stressed out at work. I was just drunk. I was just high. I don't know what happened. I was just angry. The flowers, the gifts, the apologies. I'm going to go to counseling. Those are the things that we're hearing in that calming phase. And we want to believe that that person we fell in love with is still there. We want to believe their words. So we fall into that calm phase again, and it'll last for a little while. It may last a few days, a few months. It may even last a year, but eventually that tension phase comes back. And the longer you're in an abusive relationship, the quicker the cycle happens. And soon you find yourself walking on eggshells all of the time because you never know when the abuse is going to begin again. And with my ex-husband in particular, it was a slow progression, which is a little unusual in terms of the escalation between the extreme emotional, verbal abuse and the physical abuse. But once the physical abuse did start, it became very extreme very quickly. And I was living in a war zone behind closed doors. And the next slide that we're going to look at is going to be the power and control wheel, which will kind of explain that a little bit better. So these are all very strategic things that abusers do when they are attempting to establish power and control over their partner. The emotional abuse, the put downs, the name calling, the, nothing you do is ever going to be good enough. You're not pretty enough. I think one commonality that many of the victims of and survivors of domestic violence I've heard across the country is no one will ever love you again. No one will ever love you the way that I love you, making you feel like you're unlovable. Isolation, they isolate you from your friends. They isolate you from your family. And the reason behind that is they don't want you to have people that you can go to for help. They want to keep you just with them. And they might use excuses like my ex-husband of, those friends are bad influences. Or in other cases, I've heard people using excuses of, I have really bad social anxiety. So I don't want to be around groups of people and I want you to stay with me and just spend time with me. And very quickly, you're losing those friendships and connections that you normally would have to reach out to for help. Minimizing, denying, and blaming. Gaslighting is probably a term that a lot of you have heard. That is in the abuser's toolkit. But they minimize their behavior, they deny their behavior, and they blame and turn everything around on you. And they're so masterful at it that it leaves your head spinning and yourself actually questioning if what they're saying is true. An example that I often use is my ex-husband was angry about something that had happened, and I was going up the stairs, he was coming down, and he purposely bumped into me very hard to the point that I fell backwards down the stairs, was hurt, was crying. And then like a half hour later asked me, what was wrong with me? Why was I crying? And I said, well, you pushed me down the stairs and I'm hurt. And he changed the dialogue. I didn't push you down the stairs, Nicole. You were angry. You bumped into me. You were being aggressive. That was on you. And so it actually leaves you questioning the events and what really happened, because they're so good at their acting skills and manipulation skills that they convince you that these things are wrong and that you really are to blame for so many things happening in the relationship. They will use children and pets. They will threaten to harm children and pets. They will threaten to take you to court and take custody, full custody, which we see happen often when the perpetrator has more money than the victim in our court system. My ex-husband would say things to me like, you will never see your children again. You will never see them graduate from high school. And it is a real fear that victims have, because we do see it happening often. Using privilege, using male privilege, in many cases, using white male privilege in many cases, to continue to establish power and control over victims, especially when it comes to our legal system and law enforcement and judicial system. Economic abuse. So this is huge. We have a lot of victims who have never worked because their abuser has told them, I don't want you to work. I just want you to stay home and take care of the kids. They don't have money coming in. They don't have a paycheck. They don't have work history. Or if they do, the abuser often is controlling all of the finances, money in, money out, and the victim does not know what is even available to them. My ex-husband, as soon as I left him, he actually was able to, against court order, remove all of our savings, all of our pension, IRAs, our children's educational funds for himself. And then he also, because he was an authorized user on my credit card, he was legally able to change the address, the phone number, and transfer 2 of his credit cards onto my credit card. So I then inherited $24,000 of his debt, and there was nothing I could do about it. And this was when I first left him. So he was doing everything he could to make me have to come back to him, to not allow me to be successful to leave him. Coercion and threats and intimidation go together. And that's when we get to the place of fear. And with my abuser in particular, towards the end of our relationship, that honeymoon phase just completely stopped. And it became very apparent that he was getting some type of pleasure from this coercion, threat, and intimidation part of this wheel. And the most significant physical abuse that occurred, he actually, he beat me up severely. He held a gun to my head, told me all of the reasons that he should and would kill me. I still don't know why he didn't pull the trigger that day, but every day after that, including the next day when he told me that I owed him an apology for almost making him kill me, it became every day, if you leave, I will hunt you down. If you leave, I will find you. If you tell anyone, I will kill you. And all of the various ways that he would do that and what would happen to my children and how I would never see my children again. So after that, I did not tell anyone what was happening behind closed doors for 4 months because I was paralyzed with fear. I was paralyzed because I knew everything he said was true. I knew how easy it was to find people with the internet this day and age. And I knew financially he would make it as hard for me as possible. So it took me 4 months and a day of realizing that if I didn't leave, I was going to end up dead, or I would end up killing him in self-defense, because I had begun to try to figure out how can I get to that gun before he does the next time, so I don't end up being the one that is murdered. And I knew then that I had to do something and I had to leave. And that's when I made a safety plan and I called my mother and was finally able to leave the relationship. And unfortunately, with my case, my ex continued to stalk me very aggressively for 2.5 years before finally being held accountable. But these are all of the ways that, my 16-year-old self, who never thought she would become this victim, now survivor, was turned by my abuser, who was very strategic and very manipulative in breaking me down and breaking my self-esteem down. So I hope this helps people understand how it happens. You can switch. So why victims stay? This is a question that pretty much every time I do a talk, people ask me because it's so hard to understand or people to grasp. Like if someone hits you, why do you stay? And part of what I've talked about already, the power control wheel, the cycle explains it, in a lot of ways. But here are, the main reasons that we hear the most often. Love, the first, we are wanting to get back to that beginning phase of the relationship where that mask is still on and things are still good and we love this person and that person loves us and we feel safe. And we want to believe when they say they're going to go to counseling. We want to believe when they say they're going to change. We have hope still at that point. Fear, there's so many reasons to be fearful of not being successful if you leave, fear that this person's going to harm you further, fear that you're going to lose custody of your children, fear of the guilt and shame, which we're going to come down to later, of just acknowledging what's happened and that you have been this victim. I remember when I first left and I actually had my ex served with a personal protection order, and I was so in fear that I was lucky enough to have a sister who lived in Canada. And I fled to her house for 2 weeks, but I had to tell my employer for the first time ever and acknowledge that I was a victim of domestic violence. And they all thought I had this perfect relationship. So I was terrified to make myself vulnerable enough to share that with them. And I was very blessed that they received that and me with all of the grace and love and help that I needed at that point in time. But it is a very scary thing to have to admit and acknowledge that you are a victim of abuse, whether it's emotional, physical, financial, sexual. It is a scary thing. Family. So not just the fear of losing custody of our children, but a lot of cultures put a lot of pressure on victims to stay in these relationships despite the abuse for religious or cultural norms. Their family is not supportive of them leaving because that is just not something that their religion or culture believes in. So that can be a big obstacle for some to overcome when they know that they're in danger and are in an abusive and unhappy relationship. Isolation, we talked about that already. If you're isolated enough by your abuser from friends and family, you don't have people to reach out to any longer. And that is an obstacle that is, again, strategically created by your abuser so that you don't have people to talk to about these things, or it's scary to talk to them if you haven't, been spending time with them. Financial, we touched on that a little bit already, but this is a huge one. If you don't have a place to go, if you can't afford an apartment, if you can't afford food, if you don't have a vehicle, these are all huge obstacles for victims of abuse to leave their abusers. And we're going to talk when we look at barriers in our county and our state for victims of why, they can't leave. Financial is a huge component. And their abuser is going to make it as hard as possible for them to be financially successful. They will show up at your job. They will cause you to get fired from your job in many cases, if you do have one. They're going to manage every nickel and dime so that you don't have a chance to save up money. And through this work, we have come up with ideas, and there are some even on our website about how to, if you are a victim, to safety plan, including this financial piece of buying gift cards when you can and stocking up on those things that your abuser may not be able to find out about. Neurochemical. So we're looking at two different aspects with neurochemical. Some of you have maybe heard of love addiction, and it does truly play a role for a lot of victims and why they stay in their abusive relationships. Because when you're in the high of the honeymoon phase and the love and things are great, you're having all these neurochemicals and, dopamine and serotonin, everything is there and everything's so wonderful. And then you go through the eggshells and the abusive episode and all of those are gone. They're gone and you're feeling depressed and you're anxious and you're sad. And then the abuser comes back around with the love and the honeymoon and the promises, and it becomes an addictive cycle with neurochemistry. And I think once people really, and I do share that in my book and kind of explain and walk through that, it helps victims understand why they feel often addicted or trapped in these relationships because of these this neurochemical component, and also ways around that, other ways of increasing those same chemicals in our brain without getting re-involved with our abuser. But it is a very, I wish more people talked about it because it helps explain it and it really helps victims understand why they ended up in this situation. The second piece to this is actually related to something Shelley mentioned earlier, and that is brain injury. The Enough Initiative is currently involved in a study with the Center for Neurological Studies and Dr. Eve Valera from Harvard on traumatic brain injury and domestic violence. Current estimates show that probably anywhere between 60 and 90% of victims of domestic violence have sustained at least one brain injury. And that could be from not just getting hit in the head, which is often, it's a very common area that abusers target because under your hair, you can't see bruising. So the head is often a target, but also being pushed down on the floor, hitting your head into objects, and then strangulation, which causes anoxic brain injury from loss of oxygen. And the goal of our study is to get the best accurate percentage of victims that have sustained brain injury, but then also look at what role does that play in them not being able to leave these abusive relationships successfully, and what treatment options can be offered for them. Because the reality is we're probably looking at numbers that are just as high as military and football players who have sustained brain injury. But no one's really doing the work and studying it. So we are taking it on. Shame from society. When I left my abusive relationship, I didn't really talk about it publicly or with people. People knew I got divorced. They didn't know it was domestic violence unless they happened to see the stalking that was happening in the community. But shame. It's difficult to acknowledge and at first, and to take ownership that happened to you. But over time, I felt compelled to share my story, and I started sharing it on social media, and people were incredibly supportive of me, and other people reached out to me, people from high school who said, I'm going through the same thing. And I learned that's how I took my power back, was by letting go of the shame and owning my story and sharing my story and talking about it and letting others know that you can overcome it and you can be strong again. And, that there's no reason for you to have shame. And then this is a huge piece, is lack of shelter and resources. If you have nowhere to go, if you're isolated from your friends and family, or your family doesn't want you leaving this relationship, you don't have anywhere to go. There is no shelter available. You have two choices. You become homeless or you go back to your abuser. And in our county in particular, that is where we are at right now. We'll talk about that a little bit more in action items, because this is a huge problem. And I have victims calling me all of the time who have nowhere to go. Sometimes we can help them. We can find people for them to stay with. We can raise money for a hotel for a short time, but lack of shelter and resources is an obstacle that we have to tackle, and we have to figure out how to do better in our county. So this is just a graph. As I talked about the increase in homicide. So murders of women in the United States in 2007, only 45% of those women were killed by an intimate partner. In 2018, 92% of women were killed by an intimate partner. And the graph above shows, I highlighted, obviously guns was, the number one way that these women were murdered, and men are murdered too, but the statistics are showing us that in terms of intimate partner homicide, 98% of those victims are female. So other could be anything from strangulation to another weapon, like a baseball bat or something like that, used in the homicide. And then the gray number reflects use of a knife. So obviously the biggest jump in reason for this is guns. And I understand you guys are going to be exploring that topic more next week or in 2 weeks, I believe. But we see a clear increase, not only in percentage, but also in the actual number of victims killed every single year. And we're also seeing a huge increase in children also being killed with the victim. So family homicides are increasing greatly in our county. Okay. Let's move on to our next slide. So these are some current issues that are impacting victims in our county and the state. So right now we have a lack of shelter to flee to when leaving abusers for victims. Safe House Center had just recently been investigated. They have not been serving victims at capacity for a long time. In fact, they've only been housing, I think, between 6 and 12 people for at least the last 6 months. And we don't have other shelters in our county that can pick up the slack of all of these people calling for help that have nowhere to go. Delana Center is typically full. We've also had the Salvation Army has been full through the last few months, and phone calls and the work that I've been doing with a lot of the victims turned away from Safe House Shelter. I've learned a lot about the housing Section 8 process that I had no idea how difficult it was to get, number one, onto a Section 8 list, but then to actually get into affordable housing in our county. It is incredibly difficult. Recent studies, and there are graphs actually shared by the Washtenaw County Office of Economic Development, show us that it's 137-day average to get into housing if you are homeless, 137 days, but up to 280 days. So if you're a victim who doesn't have a work history, you don't have a stable income, you don't have good credit history, which I wouldn't have because my ex-husband ruined my credit, apartments can deny you, and they do deny you. And many of the victims that I've been working with have been denied and denied and denied even after they're accepted into the Section 8 programs, either under the Violence Against Women's Act or rapid rehousing or the homelessness grant. It's a huge problem. And if they have nowhere to go, their options are, again, becoming homeless or returning to their abusers. And, I always hear people saying, just leave, just leave. So when you're a victim and you're ready to leave and you're ready to take the step and you want to become independent and there is nowhere for you to go, what do you do? And that is one of the calls to action that we're going to talk about shortly. Another major issue in our county is judges and magistrates letting abusers walk out of court after arrest without bond. So they are often, I've sat through many arraignments over the course of the past 4 months, thankfully, because they're virtual and I can do that and they're recorded. And victim abusers are being released in sometimes 8 hours, 10 hours with no bond. So victims have no time to leave. They have no time to obtain a personal protection order because their abuser is coming right back out and they're more angry and they're more upset before they were arrested. So this is another huge problem in our county. And I do understand and respect that some crimes, there should not be bond if they're, small misdemeanors where people aren't being hurt and affected, especially when I've seen sat in arraignments when someone is on their 3rd or 4th domestic violence charge and they are released yet again with no bond back into the community. It is a huge problem and victims are going to stop calling the police. They're going to stop asking for help. They are just going to stay in these relationships because they're not going to feel safe when this continues to happen in our county. Litigation abuse through family court is another huge problem. We see abusers filing frivolous motions regarding divorce and custody as another form of financial abuse and control. So they file motions over any single thing they can think of, and the victim is then forced to go to court, take time off from work, time and time again, so that they can go to these frivolous hearings that are being brought forward by their abusers. And I'm very excited to say that Judge Tracy Vanderberg is having me come speak to her family law class this upcoming week about this exactly, because if you're not familiar with the cycle of abuse, if you're not familiar with the manipulation looks like as a magistrate or a judge, it may be easy to miss and understand what the abusers are doing. So this is a huge problem. And we are seeing, because often the abusers have more money, they can out attorney the victim. And I myself, at the end, I was representing myself for custody. I represented myself to get a motion to be able to get my kids out of the state because I could not afford an attorney. And I see some questions popping up and I'll get to them in just a minute. Lax firearm laws related to perpetrators of abuse, which we're going to talk about again in a minute when we get to the calls of action. Lack of prevention programs targeting teens and young adults. They're not happening. And they should be happening at every high school in our state if we really want to ever see a reduction in domestic violence in our country, in our nation, because without prevention, without teaching the red flags, without teaching what to look out for and when to run, we're going to continue to see abusive relationships. And I can say every time I speak at high school or college, I have a line of students waiting to talk to me afterwards to say, I had no idea I was in an abusive relationship. Everything you said, I'm experiencing with the person I'm dating. I didn't know it was abuse. I thought it was love. I thought he just cared about me. I thought he just wanted to make sure I was safe. So until those red flags, like I was never taught, we're going to continue to see this epidemic grow and continue as it has. I do want to add that our state of Michigan Domestic Violence Sexual Assault Coalition used our prevention funding, $500,000 of it in 2019, I believe, to plant trees and green spaces in 3 cities in our state. So Kalamazoo, Detroit, and Houghton, Michigan were the 3 cities chosen. And the prevention, $500,000 of the prevention funding went to planting green spaces based on one study of one apartment building that general violence was shown to be reduced, but not domestic violence. So to me, that's a huge problem, that is the choice that we made as a state at that level, to use that money instead of educating young people, planting trees and flowers. And lastly, societal norms still perpetuate victim blaming and shaming. And, that's something we all have to make sure that we stop doing, because by blaming victims and shaming them, that's how victims become less valued, and shelters for them become not a priority because they chose to be in these relationships, right? They chose that partner. They must like being abused. When we have an animal shelter in our county that is nicer on the inside and cleaner and has more animals being housed than domestic violence shelter in the same county, we have a huge problem. And we have to lift up and stop victim blaming and shaming, so that we're making sure that victims are empowered and given the resources they need to become resilient and independent. So just some local news that kind of reinforces some of the things that I just talked about. In Detroit, many of you probably have heard about the case of the man who doused his pregnant girlfriend in lighter fluid and set her on fire. This was just, I think, 2 weeks ago. And he was released from jail on a $5,000 bond. So once, not until the case gained national attention, did the judge come up with a higher bond, but that was the bond. $5,000, you've set this woman on fire who's pregnant, and $5,000 gets you out of jail. Next is just in MLive this week, the investigation in Ann Arbor of domestic violence shelter finds lapses and the director resigns. We don't have enough shelter for victims in our county, and we really need to look at best practice for helping victims become resilient and empowered and leave these relationships, but have a safe place to go. Otherwise, they will become homeless or they will go back to their abusers. And right now, with COVID and it being as cold as it is, the more likely of those two is that they're going to stay with their abusers and be at risk of further abuse and homicide. Federal law currently does not require the removal of guns that abusers already possess when they become prohibited, nor do they outline what a removal process looks like. So if you get a personal protection order in our state that says clearly that the abuser is not allowed to have firearms, there's nothing in place to ensure that that abuser turns over the firearms or that they're removed from the home. The way it was explained to me when I got my personal protection order and knew that my ex-husband had firearms was that the abusers are expected to turn over their weapons, which we all know is never going to happen. So that's another huge problem. And that's something that we can we'll look at that as an action item in a moment. And then this just came out of the most recent report from the Washtenaw County Office of Economic Development. In 2021, up until October, 449 people, including families, were experiencing homelessness at the end of November. And 137 average days from intake to permanent housing was what they found. And they demonstrated a 35% increase in homelessness in that year. So from 2020 to 2021, in our county, there's been a 35% increase in homeless people in our county. And as we discussed several times before, the leading cause or one of the leading causes of homelessness in women and children is domestic violence. So we know it's contributing. I've talked to the Office of Economic Development about trying to capture that data more specifically in surveys and phone calls. And I've also gone and done training with Hawk and Salvation Army and Delana's staff on safety planning for victims when there's no place for them to go and they're forced to stay with their abusers. Also lethality assessments so that they can basically classify how at risk the person is for being killed by their partner, and that person can hopefully be put on some type of expedited list for a hotel voucher or a housing program. And also just in general, working with victims of domestic violence, what that best practice looks like as someone taking a crisis call, because Delanis and Salvation Army, Hawk, and Barrier Busters are taking those calls while the issues at Safe House are in progress of being resolved. Okay, so calls to action. These are just a few things that I would love to see happen. Contact our county legislators and request more shelter facilities for domestic violence and sexual assault victims in our county. So we have money, and a lot of people have told me there is money. There's COVID funding, there's mental health grants, there's violence against women funding. There's lots of sources and money available to increase shelter spaces and making sure that victims have a safe place to go when they're leaving their abusers. Contact county and state legislators and request that funding be put into place for dating violence prevention programs in high schools in our county and our state, so that we can begin to prevent the epidemic rather than putting out fires and putting band-aids on all of the issues that are coming out of domestic violence. Firearms surrender when a personal protection order is issued. So I did talk to Ariane Slay a few days ago, and she said that the ordinance for the city of Ann Arbor will be going up for public hearing and will be occurring in the next 6 months to ensure that if there is a personal protection order issued, there is a plan for getting the firearms out of the abuser's hands, including having law enforcement collect those firearms from the abusive party. So that's something to definitely be watching out for with Ann Arbor City Council. Another item of concern that I've been hearing and just learning more about this is the proposal for unarmed response for domestic violence calls. So I know that there's been a big push for unarmed response for crimes like neighbors having disagreements or property lines, but while that might make sense in those cases, it's absolutely terrifying to think about a social worker who is unarmed responding to a domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking call, because they are not going to have the skills necessary to ensure victim safety, and they are probably going to be actually put at risk themselves as mental health professionals responding to these domestic violence calls where abusers are out of control, may be armed. So this is another thing that is being proposed at upcoming Ann Arbor City Council meetings. And I think it's very important. I know they've gotten information and research from academics, but I think it's crucial that they're also getting information from victims and survivors, and the mental health professionals that they're proposing will be doing the response to domestic violence calls about how effective they think this will be for actually helping the situation. It's a dangerous, slippery slope. So that's an item I'm very, very concerned about. And then lastly, implementation of required domestic violence and litigation abuse trainings for judges, magistrates, mediators, and guardian ad litem, so that they can see through the manipulative tactics that abusers use in family court. Because I have sat through mediations, I have sat through personal protection hearings, and I've seen some absolutely unbelievable, stunning things happen where people are not even listening to victims and making decisions just based on the way the perpetrator appears, which, as most of us know, is very charming and educated, and they're often lawyered up. So I would love to see required domestic violence trainings for our judges, magistrates that are making those decisions about custody and personal protection orders. So I saw questions popping up in the chat, but of course, because I was talking and focused, I wasn't able to read them all, but I know someone will be reading them to me.
Right, yes. We do have some questions that came in prior, and then we will read the questions that came in on the chat. And it's very interesting. One of the questions that came to me as I was preparing for this is that there's a statistic that 85% of domestic violence victims are women. And I guess it's even more than that based on some of what you said. And I actually heard that some men report domestic abuse when it's really their female partners defending themselves. Is that something that, is that a real thing? Does that happen?
I mean, it can absolutely happen. And I've even seen victims arrested because the abusers are so convincing when that 911 call is made, or will even self-inflict harm upon themselves so that the victim is arrested when that 911 call is made. So while there, yes, absolutely are male victims of domestic violence, 100% true. There are also cases where the perpetrator, once law enforcement arrives, will paint themselves as the victim convincingly enough that the victim is arrested for domestic violence.
I had another question from one of our registrants about conflating sexual assault and domestic violence. And I was having trouble understanding this question, that they shouldn't be confused, and sexual assault covers much more than domestic violence. Can you speak to that at all?
Could you, what was the original question?
Well, this is what she said. Why does the title of this talk include sexual assault? The two should not be confused, domestic violence and sexual assault. Sexual assault covers much more.
Yeah, so, I mean, they definitely can occur together, because many victims of domestic violence do experience sexual assault by their partner, but also sexual assault can occur by strangers.
Right.
Right, we know that, and by early on dating violence, but it absolutely does occur and is a part of domestic violence and the domestic violence cycle for many victims.
Mhm.
They will be sexually assaulted by their partner who feels that they own them. They have complete power and control, and they should be allowed to sexually assault and have sex with their victim partner whenever they want to. So they definitely happen together. And then they also happen separately. And the issues around the shelter problems that we have in our county right now affect all of the above. Because if you're a victim of sexual assault, needing a safe place to go, and people to believe you, and not victim blame and shame, the same things you're facing as a domestic violence victim. So there is overlap, but there's also separate issues, absolutely.
Okay. This was an interesting question too. I thought, what are the most effective ways of inviting abused people to seek help? And, I think that many of us may have known someone that we suspected, but, how does one approach that?
Yeah, so it can be a difficult conversation, but I think if we can open the door by maybe saying something like, I noticed this, or I was wondering about this. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here and I'm available. And even when people admit to us, that they're in this abusive relationship, but they may not be ready to leave yet, it's crucial to let them know that even though they're not ready to leave yet, that you will be there for them with an open door when they are ready, when the abuse happens again. Because then they'll know, because they're isolated from so many other people, that you are a person that they can come to when they are ready And it does, statistics are still showing it takes several attempts, up to 7, to successfully leave, especially if you don't have the supports in place to leave these relationships. So knowing just that you have someone safe to talk to can be crucial for a victim who's contemplating leaving their relationship.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question that came in was, do volunteers still meet the survivor after the arrest of a perpetrator? I don't know if there's like a program in Washtenaw County where this is done, or.
Could you say it one more time, Shelley?
Okay. So do volunteers still meet the survivor after the arrest of the perpetrator? So I don't know if this individual is referring to a specific program that might have existed in Washtenaw County, or.
Yeah, I wonder if would the person be able to clarify who answered that or asked that question so I could answer it.
If they're in the audience, I don't have the name right in front of me, but if they're in the audience and they care to do so, then please put some clarification in the chat, and we'd be happy to circle back to that. Now, I thought it was interesting, the statistic where about gun violence and how many women are in 2008. I can't remember what the exact statistic was, but it was 2007, 45% of victims were, there was gun violence, and now it's like 92%. And one of the questions that came in is, has the problem increased during COVID, which I have to think it absolutely must have done.
Yeah, nationally, actually not just nationally, but in most other countries, statistics are showing that the problem has absolutely increased with domestic violence and people being even more isolated due to COVID, being with their abusers, stuck in a house with their abusers. It's depending on the area, the numbers vary, but there's absolutely been an increase, and it's even harder to get into, to leave with the restrictions in place. And if there's a COVID outbreak and shelters having space for people because of COVID. So there's definitely, COVID's contributed very detrimentally to domestic violence, absolutely, for many reasons, but the increase is there. And we see often an increase of domestic violence around the holidays, which we just got through, and we also see an increase around the Super Bowl. And then the other month, these are just trends from studying, is August. So we've got those factors combined with COVID. So the increase is definitely impacting victims.
Before we go to the questions in the chat, and a question that occurred to me is, we see so much about what needs to, in your presentation, which was really informative, and it was just great. And we see so much that needs to be done, and we see so many, really shocking and horrifying statistics and everything. Are there things that you have seen happen in recent years that are hopeful signs?
Yeah, so I can speak to the fact that we began the proposal for the address confidentiality bill back in 2017 in our state. I testified before Senate 3 times on that bill. It died 3 times, but on the 4th time, it passed through. So it was signed into existence in December of 2020, and the budget was approved. And so it should be in place, I would hope, within the next year. And if any of you are not familiar with what that program does, is it offers a PO box as a safe address for victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, sex trafficking, where their identity, including their driver's license, voter registration card, state, like as a clinical social worker, my state registration, all of that information would have a PO box on it rather than my physical address. So it makes it much more difficult for an abuser to find a victim under this program. And then the victim's mail goes to the PO box, and then from the PO box is delivered to their physical address, or it can be picked up by the victims. It took us years to get it passed, but it shows like there were a small group of advocates that kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and it was finally passed, which was a huge victory and made me very hopeful, because if we look at the number of domestic violence bills brought forward to the state legislators versus the animal abuse bills, like the animal abuse bills are passed. This was the first domestic violence related bill that I think has passed in about 10 years in terms of safety for victims. And so it is huge, and it's huge that the budget passed and was approved. So that is hope. That is hope. Also, hope to me is that in Washtenaw County, we have gotten every police department, including Washtenaw County Sheriff's Department, on board with doing lethality assessments. So that was a push we started several years ago, so that every officer, when they are responding to a 911 call, is asking a series of questions that helps determine how at risk this victim is of being killed by their partner. And so that serves a few different things. Number one, the officer can make decisions for arrest. Number two, the judge can hopefully look at that assessment and make decisions regarding bond. But then also for the victim themselves, once they recognize how at risk they may be for being killed, if they do not leave this relationship, it can be eye-opening, and it can be the thing that finally pushes them to leave that relationship. So that is also a very positive and hopeful thing that's happened in our county in the last few years.
That's great. All right. Well, Deshawn, why don't you give us the questions that were in the chat?
Yes, one of the very first comments was from Harvey Summers, who said, if trends tell us 2,300 women may be murdered in the United States by their partners this year, is a murder mystery really an appropriate theme for a fundraiser? Which also came up in my mind. So this maybe that came up in somebody else's mind too.
Yeah, we make sure that it is not domestic violence related whatsoever. The topic, in fact, we did one last year very successfully. And when I talked to the team that was planning it, it was like, I wanted absolutely nothing to do with domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So we made sure that it was not related in any way. And it's a very, I don't want to say silly, but outlandish type of murder mystery that's more about having fun and solving clues, so that we aren't, reinforcing in any way, intimate partner violence.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question from Alice Friedman. Please describe the proposal Unarmed response to domestic violence calls. I'm meeting with my Ann Arbor council person next week.
So from my understanding, and this is, I talked to City Attorney Ariane Slay about this proposal, is that the proposal would be that instead of law enforcement officers responding to domestic violence calls, social workers would be responding to the 911 calls. They would be unarmed. They would be sent to attempt to de-escalate the situation. But as a victim of domestic violence, that causes me a great deal of anxiety and fear, because knowing that someone really doesn't have a way to protect you because, they don't have the training, they don't have, they're not armed in any way. And that's who's responding when you're possibly terrified that you're going to be murdered by this person. just doesn't seem like the correct skill set of who should be responding to domestic violence and sexual assaults calls.
That would,
Problem
that
with
would-
being paired. I'm sorry.
that would be my thought too. I mean, it's scary. There's got to be an approach, a partnership approach. Somehow, maybe the officers can be given special skills, but it's a great area for discussion.
It is. And, you know, I think I heard about it for the first time about 8 months ago. And it was kind of like, this is new. And once I heard that it was actually moving forward, I've become much more in tuned and concerned about what that would look like. So at these upcoming meetings, I think it's going to be really important to get information and also express opinions about how people feel about that happening.
I know that domestic violence is the most dangerous cop call of all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've had, you know, many officers in our state have been killed, responding or, you know, seriously injured and responding to domestic violence calls when they arrive on the scene. You know, and that it could lead to so many things, hostage situations, all sorts of things if someone's appearing on scene unarmed and untrained.
Thank you.
And Shelley, do we have time for more questions?
Oh, you're muted, Shelley.
Yeah, sorry about that. We are approaching the end of our time. And I do want to say that Nicole had actually offered after we finished recording to stay a little bit and answer questions that people might not want to have asked to be recorded. So I guess maybe we could take a couple more questions and then wrap it up, and then Nicole will stay for a few minutes, maybe, you know, 5 or 10 minutes after, if we, you know, so why don't you go ahead and pick a couple of the questions in the chat, Dee?
Sure. Here's a question. What judges are most likely to release abusers without bond?
Am I allowed to answer that question? Well, I would say there are a few magistrates in particular who have actually, I think, even recently been in the news for some of the bond conditions that resulted in one individual going out and killing another couple. And also there was a young child shot and that person was reduced on a very small bond. And I know that is like one of the courtrooms that I've seen multiple abusers be just let out without any type of bond condition. But I think as a general statement, like it would be interesting, you know, to be able to really look at statistics of that. But also it's obviously those who do not have the training and understanding of domestic violence. And that's why I'm hopeful that that is something that can be developed in our county, because we are seeing it as a gap in understanding and the abuse being continued to be perpetrated, not just at the criminal level, but also at that family court level.
And just one last one, I think, before we open it up to people after we stop recording, is the League of Women Voters in Washtenaw County going to undertake any of these calls to action as a group?
Well,
So. Oh, Shelley, you're muted again.
oh, I think that's a question for the league to answer and not Nicole, but perhaps I was glad to see it asked. And I think it's something that, you know, league members can contact the board or, you know, people who are the heads of committees that they know and request, you know, to get some kind of a ball rolling on that. But I think, okay, right now I'd just like to say a few closing words. The first thing I'd like to say is that I'd just like to read Susan Woolley's comment, which is that Nicole's presentation shows what a dedicated woman can achieve. My thanks to her for this inspiring talk. And I think this really, Nicole, you show so much about what a woman taking her own power and really as a force for good in the world. So just a few things. On Wednesday, February 9th at 7 p.m. on Brews and Views, Teresa Reed will host Patrick Carter, MD, UM Injury Prevention of the UM Injury Prevention Center to discuss women, children, and guns. And on Friday, February 22nd at noon on Lunch and Learn, I will host Helena Lovelock, the health officer of Washtenaw County, to discuss the effects of the pandemic on public health. So we hope you'll join us all for these informative programs. Look for details via email or on our website at lwvwashtenaw.org or on our Facebook page at facebook.com/lwvwashtenaw.